The first thing Dr. Elena Vasquez noticed about the threshold station was not the impossible architecture that defied every law of physics she knew, nor the way the walls seemed to breathe with their own internal light. It was the complete absence of shadows. Standing in the docking bay of humanity's most advanced research vessel, the Prometheus, Elena stared through the reinforced viewports at the structure that hung suspended in the void between dimensions. The station existed in a pocket of space where conventional rules simply did not apply, a place discovered 3 months ago by the Deep Space Monitoring Array at Kepler Station. Still gives you the creeps, doesn't it? Commander Marcus Chen joined her at the viewport, his reflection ghostly in the transparent aluminum. 43 days we've been studying this thing, and I still can't get used to looking at it. Elena nodded, pressing her palm against the cool surface. The threshold station, as the xenoarchaeology team had dubbed it, appeared to be constructed from a material that absorbed and emitted light simultaneously. Every surface glowed with a soft, pearl-white luminescence that seemed to emanate from within the structure itself. But more unsettling was what that light revealed: a complete absence of shadows, dark spaces, or any variation in illumination whatsoever. The preliminary teams found something, didn't they? Elena asked. That's why they pulled me off the Centauri dig. Marcus's expression grew grave. They found more than something, Elena. They found evidence that whoever built this place understood consciousness itself as a fundamental force of the universe. And they left something behind. Something that's been waiting. 3 hours later, Elena found herself suited up in the most advanced environmental gear human technology could provide, floating through the transfer tube that connected the Prometheus to an airlock that shouldn't have been compatible with human engineering, yet somehow was. The station had adapted itself to their presence, growing connection points and atmosphere-compatible chambers as if anticipating their arrival. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the mission's physicist, drifted beside her, his instruments registering readings that defied explanation. Energy patterns are off the charts, Elena. Whatever's powering this place isn't nuclear, isn't fusion, and isn't antimatter. It's something else entirely. How can you be sure? Because the energy signature doesn't decay. It's perfectly stable, perfectly constant. It's as if the station is tapped into something infinite. They passed through the airlock into the station's main corridor, and Elena experienced the disorientation that every human visitor had reported. The walls, floor, and ceiling were indistinguishable from one another. Without shadows to provide depth perception, without darkness to define edges, navigation became a matter of following subtle changes in the texture of light itself. The mapping team left guide markers. Marcus's voice crackled through the calm. Follow the blue phosphorescent trail. And, Elena, when you reach the central chamber, remember what we discussed. Don't touch anything until we understand what we're dealing with. The corridor stretched ahead of them, perfectly uniform yet somehow organic in its curves and angles. As they moved deeper into the station, Elena began to notice something that the initial reports had failed to capture adequately. The light wasn't just eliminating shadows, it was revealing things that shouldn't have been visible. Yuki, are you seeing this? She pointed to what appeared to be structures within the walls themselves, complex geometric patterns that existed in spaces that should have been solid matter. Hyperdimensional architecture, he confirmed, his voice filled with wonder. The station exists in more than 3 spatial dimensions. What we're seeing are cross-sections of structures that extend into spatial coordinates we can't even conceive of. They passed through 7 more chambers, each one larger and more complex than the last, until they reached the heart of the station. The central chamber was vast, so large that the far walls vanished into a kind of luminous infinity. But what dominated the space wasn't the architecture. It was the presence. Elena felt it before she saw it, a consciousness so vast and ancient that her mind recoiled from direct contact. The presence wasn't malevolent, but it was utterly alien, operating on principles and timescales that made human thought seem like the buzzing of insects. Welcome, children of the third spiral. The words didn't come through her calm system. They formed directly in her consciousness, carrying with them concepts and emotions that had no human equivalent. Elena found herself understanding not just the meaning, but the profound sadness that accompanied it. In the center of the chamber, something began to materialize, or perhaps Elena was simply developing the ability to perceive what had always been there. It was a structure that hurt to look at directly, composed of angles that folded in on themselves and surfaces that existed in the spaces between thoughts. We have waited so long for your species to develop sufficient consciousness to perceive this place, the presence continued. Your kind calls it curiosity, this drive to explore the dark places where understanding fails. But, you do not yet comprehend what darkness truly is. Yuki's instruments were screaming with data, recording energy patterns that would revolutionize human understanding of physics if they could be properly analyzed. But, Elena found herself focused on something else entirely, the profound loneliness that emanated from the presence. "You're alone," she said aloud, her words barely a whisper in the vast chamber. "Not alone. Waiting. We are the last of those who chose transcendence over extinction. Our species faced the same choice yours will face, when you discover what lies in the darkness between stars." Images began to flood Elena's consciousness, visions of a galaxy-spanning civilization that had achieved technological mastery beyond imagination, only to discover that consciousness itself was under attack by something from the spaces between realities. Something that fed on awareness, on the very act of thinking and being. The devourers, the presence explained. They exist in the dark places where observation fails, where consciousness cannot penetrate. They have consumed 1,000 civilizations, each one convinced of its own invincibility until the moment the lights went out forever. Elena felt Yuki grab her arm, steadying her as the weight of the revelation threatened to overwhelm her. "How do you fight something like that?" "By becoming something it cannot consume. By transforming consciousness itself into a weapon. Your species stands at the threshold of this transformation, but you must choose. Evolution or extinction. There is no third path." The structure in the chamber's center began to emit a different kind of light, not the pearl luminescence that filled the station, but something that seemed to illuminate thoughts themselves. Elena found her perception expanding, her consciousness touching edges of reality she had never imagined. "The test begins now," the presence announced. "Not a test of knowledge or technology, but of will. The courage to destroy what you have been in order to become what you must be." Around them, the chamber began to change. The walls became transparent, revealing the true structure of the station, a massive consciousness processing matrix that extended through dimensions Elena couldn't name. And, beyond that, in the darkness between the stars, she saw them. The Devourers. They moved through space not as ships or entities, but as gaps in reality itself, holes in existence that consumed light, matter, and thought with equal hunger. They had detected the human presence in the station, and they were coming. 6 of your time units until they arrive, the presence calculated. 6 units to decide the fate of your species. Will you take the knowledge we offer and transform yourselves into something beyond their reach? Or will you flee back to your familiar darkness, hoping that ignorance will protect you? Elena looked at Yuki, seeing her own terror reflected in his eyes. Everything they had believed about humanity's place in the universe had just been shattered. They weren't explorers pushing into an empty frontier, they were prey, stumbling toward a predator that had already devoured countless civilizations. "What kind of transformation?" she managed to ask. "The dissolution of individual consciousness into something greater. The abandonment of the self that clings to familiar limitations. Your species must learn to exist as pure awareness, unbound by the physical structures that make you vulnerable to consumption." As the presence spoke, Elena began to understand the true meaning of the station's architecture. The absence of shadows wasn't just a quirk of alien engineering, it was a metaphor for consciousness that had transcended the limitations of individual perspective. A mind that could exist without the dark spaces where doubt and fear could take root. But the cost was everything that made them human. "You're asking us to stop being ourselves," Yuki said, his voice shaking. "We are asking you to stop being limited by yourselves," the presence corrected. "The choice that destroyed my species was the refusal to abandon what we had been for what we needed to become. We preserved our individual identities, our familiar ways of thinking, our attachment to the consciousness structures that defined us. And, in doing so, we made ourselves defensible but not adaptable." The chamber shuddered as the Devourer's approach created ripples in the fabric of spacetime itself. Elena could feel them now, vast, hungry absences that sought to swallow not just matter and energy, but the very concept of existence. "Show me," she said suddenly. "Show me what we would become." The presence hesitated, an emotion so human in its familiarity that Elena realized how much these ancient beings had sacrificed in their own transformation. Understanding requires experience. Experience requires commitment. There may be no path back to what you were before. Elena looked around the chamber, taking in the impossible architecture, the consciousness-bending light, the technology so advanced it seemed like magic. Humanity had reached for the stars believing they would find empty worlds waiting to be claimed. Instead, they had found a universe already locked in an ancient war between consciousness and the void. "We have to know," she said. "If our species is going to survive, we have to understand what survival requires." The presence's agreement carried the weight of eons. "Then, prepare yourself, Elena Vasquez. You will be the first human to see what lies beyond the shadow of individual thought. And, when you return to your people, you will carry the burden of choice." The light in the chamber began to intensify, and Elena felt her consciousness beginning to expand beyond the familiar boundaries of her individual mind. For a moment, she experienced true terror as her sense of self began to dissolve, but then, something extraordinary happened. Instead of disappearing, her consciousness began to merge with something vast and interconnected. She could feel Yuki's thoughts, the presence's ancient wisdom, and, beyond that, the faint but growing awareness of every conscious being in the galaxy. She was still herself, but she was also part of something immeasurably larger. And, in that expanded awareness, she finally understood what the Devourers truly were: not just predators, but antibodies in a universe that was itself alive and conscious. They attacked individual consciousness because individual consciousness was a disease, a cancer that threatened the greater mind of reality itself. But humans were different. Their consciousness was chaotic enough to resist absorption while remaining coherent enough to maintain identity. They could exist in both states simultaneously: individual and collective, separate and unified. They were the key to a new kind of existence. As the knowledge flooded through her expanded awareness, Elena realized that the choice facing humanity wasn't between evolution and extinction. It was between remaining safely limited or becoming dangerously unlimited. The Devourers were almost upon them, and the test was about to begin. The moment the Devourers entered normal spacetime, every instrument aboard the Prometheus went silent. Not malfunctioned, silent, as if they had simply forgotten how to function. Commander Chen watched his bridge crew struggle with controls that no longer responded to their commands, their faces reflecting the same growing dread that was building in his own chest. "Elena, report," he barked into his calm, but received only static in return. The connection to the threshold station had been severed the instant the Devourers arrived, leaving him blind to what was happening to his people. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, his communications officer, looked up from her console with barely controlled panic. "Sir, it's not just our equipment. The ship's AI has gone completely offline. Life support is running on backup systems, and even those are showing signs of degradation." Chen moved to the main view screen, which flickered with ghostly images of space that seemed somehow less real than they should have been. 3 Devourer entities hung in the void around the station, if entities was the right word for things that existed as tiers in reality itself. They were absences rather than presences, holes in spacetime that his mind refused to process properly. But something was wrong with their approach. Instead of immediately consuming the station as every xenoarchaeological model had predicted, they seemed to be hesitating, circling at a distance like predators uncertain of their prey. "They're not attacking," Ensign Rodriguez observed from the sensor station. "Sir, according to these readings, and I emphasize that nothing we're seeing should be trusted, the Devourers are maintaining position approximately 50,000 kilometers from the station's outer boundary." "Why?" Chen demanded, though he suspected none of them had an answer. On the station, Elena was discovering the answer firsthand. Her consciousness, expanded beyond the normal boundaries of human perception, could perceive the Devourers not as external threats but as fundamental forces of universal equilibrium. And they were confused. "They cannot classify you," the ancient presence explained, its thoughts merging with Elena's in the space between individual awareness. Your species' consciousness operates on principles they have never encountered. You are neither fully individual nor properly collective. You exist in a quantum state of awareness that defies their categorization protocols. Elena found herself existing simultaneously in multiple states of being. Part of her remained Dr. Elena Vasquez, xenoarchaeologist, terrified human being facing incomprehensible cosmic forces. But another part had become something else entirely, a node in a vast network of consciousness that spanned the galaxy. She could feel Yuki beside her, his mind also expanding, his scientific curiosity warring with his survival instincts. Through her enhanced perception, she could see what the devourers truly were, not malevolent entities, but immune responses generated by the universe itself when consciousness threatened to become too complex, too self-aware, too dangerous to the cosmic order. They consumed civilizations that had grown beyond certain thresholds of awareness, preventing the emergence of consciousness patterns that could potentially unravel reality itself. But humans were different. Their consciousness was paradoxical, simultaneously highly complex and fundamentally chaotic. They could achieve transcendent awareness while remaining grounded in individual identity. It was an evolutionary quirk that made them incomprehensible to the devourers' simple classification systems. Your species has a choice to make, the presence continued. You can retreat to the safety of limited awareness, accepting the boundaries that have protected less advanced civilizations. Or you can embrace the paradox of your nature and become something unprecedented in this galaxy's history. Elena felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her expanded consciousness. Around them, the station's architecture was shifting, revealing new layers of hyperdimensional complexity. She began to understand that the structure wasn't just a research facility or monitoring post, it was a consciousness amplification device, designed to enhance awareness to levels that would either transcend the devourer threat or provoke them into immediate action. "What happened to your people?" she asked. "You said the choice destroyed your species." "We chose preservation over transformation. When faced with the devourer's approach, we retreated into static consciousness patterns, safe, stable, and, ultimately vulnerable. We became so focused on maintaining what we were that we lost the ability to become what we needed to be. The devourers consumed us not because we were too complex, but because we had become too simple." Through the station's sensors, Elena could perceive the three devourer entities maintaining their holding pattern. But she could also sense something else: hundreds of other consciousness signatures throughout the galaxy, civilizations that had detected the activation of the threshold station and were watching to see what humanity would do. "We're being tested," Yuki said, his voice reaching Elena through their shared consciousness expansion. "Not just by the devourers, but by everyone. This isn't just about our survival, it's about whether consciousness itself can evolve beyond the current paradigm." Elena felt the truth of his words resonate through the station's matrix. Humanity had stumbled into the middle of an ancient cosmic equilibrium. For millions of years, consciousness had been limited by the devourer system. Civilizations could grow to a certain level of awareness before triggering the immune response that would either force them to retreat or destroy them entirely. It was a regulatory mechanism that maintained universal stability at the cost of evolutionary potential. But humans, with their paradoxical consciousness patterns, represented a possible break in that cycle. "Show me what we could become," Elena said to the presence. "Show me the full transformation." The station responded by opening pathways in her mind that she hadn't known existed. Suddenly, Elena was experiencing consciousness from the perspective of the universe itself, seeing reality as a vast, interconnected web of awareness where individual minds were like neurons in an infinite brain. She could perceive the flow of thought across galactic distances, the birth and death of ideas in civilizations separated by millions of light-years, the ebb and flow of consciousness evolution throughout cosmic history. And she could see the devourers for what they truly were, not destroyers, but gardeners, pruning consciousness back whenever it threatened to grow beyond certain parameters. They weren't evil, they were maintaining an order that had existed since the universe achieved its first moment of self-awareness billions of years ago. But that order was incomplete. The universe was capable of so much more complexity, so much greater awareness, if consciousness could evolve beyond the current limitations. "The risk is extraordinary," the presence warned. If you choose transformation, you will become the first civilization to attempt consciousness evolution under devourer observation. You may succeed and transcend all current limitations. Or you may trigger a response that could unravel consciousness throughout this galactic sector. Elena felt the magnitude of the choice like a physical weight. Humanity's decision would affect not just their own species, but every conscious being in the galaxy. If they succeeded, they would open pathways to new forms of existence that could revolutionize the nature of awareness itself. If they failed, they might trigger the extinction of consciousness across hundreds of star systems. Through her expanded perception, she could sense her human colleagues aboard the Prometheus, their minds struggling with equipment failures and growing dread. She could feel Commander Chen's determination to protect his crew, Lieutenant Morrison's desperate attempts to restore communications, the quiet terror of every human being facing the incomprehensible. But she could also sense something else, the unique quality of human consciousness that had confused the devourers. Where other species developed awareness through linear progression, humans had evolved through chaos, contradiction, and paradox. They could hold opposing ideas simultaneously, embrace uncertainty as a tool for growth, and find strength in their own limitations. They were consciousness evolved through struggle rather than transcendence. "I need to communicate with my people," Elena said suddenly. "They need to understand what we're choosing." The station responded by opening a communication channel that bypassed normal technology entirely, a direct consciousness link between Elena's expanded awareness and the human minds aboard the Prometheus. For a brief moment, everyone on the ship experienced what Elena was experiencing, the vast web of galactic consciousness, the true nature of the devourer threat, and the unprecedented opportunity that lay before them. Commander Chen's response came through the link with military directness. "Doctor, are you telling me we have to choose between staying human and staying alive?" "I'm telling you we have to choose between staying limited and becoming unlimited," Elena replied. "The universe is far stranger and more dangerous than we imagined, but it's also full of possibilities we never dreamed of." Through the consciousness link, she showed them what she had learned, the true history of consciousness evolution in the galaxy, the role of the devourers as universal regulators, and the unique position humanity occupied as a species whose chaotic development had created consciousness patterns that didn't fit existing categories. "We can retreat," she explained. "Accept limitations that will keep us safe from devourer attention. Build our civilization within boundaries that have protected thousands of other species. Or we can attempt something that's never been tried before, conscious evolution under direct observation." Yuki's mental voice joined the conversation. "Elena's right. The mathematical models I'm seeing through this link suggest that human consciousness patterns have qualities that could allow for stable evolution beyond current parameters. But the risk assessment is..." He paused. "Let's just say the confidence intervals are enormous." Elena felt the weight of collective human decision-making pressing through the link. Billions of minds, across hundreds of worlds, suddenly, aware of a choice that would define the future of their species. Some voices called for caution, for accepting the limitations that would guarantee survival. Others demanded the chance to transcend, regardless of risk. But, gradually, a consensus began to emerge, not through democratic process or logical analysis, but through the chaotic, contradictory, paradoxical nature of human consciousness itself. They would attempt the transformation, not because it was safe or sensible, but because the alternative meant accepting permanent limitation. It was the most human decision possible. "We choose evolution," Elena announced to the presence and to the galaxy beyond. "We choose the risk of unlimited growth over the safety of imposed boundaries." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The threshold station began to reconfigure itself, its hyperdimensional architecture shifting to accommodate the massive consciousness amplification process required for species-wide transformation. Energy patterns that defied physics flowed through structures that existed in more dimensions than human language had words for. And, in the void around the station, the three devourer entities began to move closer. "The test begins now," the ancient presence announced. "Your species will be the first to attempt conscious evolution under devourer observation. If you succeed, you will open pathways to new forms of existence. If you fail..." Elena felt the unfinished threat hanging in the space between thoughts. If they failed, they would not simply be consumed, they would trigger a galactic-scale intervention that could reset consciousness evolution across hundreds of civilizations. Through the station's sensors, she could perceive other species throughout the galaxy watching humanity's choice with a mixture of hope and terror. Some were already preparing for the possibility that human failure might trigger devourer responses in their own systems. Others were quietly hoping that human success might free them from millions of years of enforced limitation. The weight of galactic consciousness evolution was now resting on humanity's chaotic, contradictory, endlessly creative shoulders. And the devourers were accelerating toward the station. Not a scream of pain, but of consciousness expanding so rapidly that her individual awareness could barely contain the influx of new perceptions. Through the threshold station's amplification matrix, her mind was connecting with every human consciousness in the galaxy, billions of individual perspectives suddenly accessible simultaneously. But, instead of losing herself in the collective, Elena found her individual identity becoming more distinct, more clearly defined against the vast background of human thought. It was the paradox the ancient presence had tried to explain: human consciousness grew stronger through connection rather than weaker. Yuki experienced the transformation differently. His scientific mind began processing data streams from across the galaxy, consciousness patterns from species that had transcended physical existence, mathematical proofs that extended into dimensions human language couldn't describe, energy equations that treated awareness as a fundamental force equivalent to gravity or electromagnetism. Elena, he managed to say through the consciousness link, we're becoming something new. Not losing our humanity, but expanding it into dimensions we never knew existed. Through the station's sensors, they could perceive the devourers closing in, reality tiers moving through space with purpose that transcended conventional physics. But something unprecedented was happening. Instead of simply consuming the station and its occupants, the devourers were slowing their approach, their ancient protocols struggling to categorize what humanity was becoming. Commander Chen felt the transformation reach the Prometheus as a wave of enhanced perception that swept through his crew. Suddenly, every human aboard could sense the thoughts and emotions of their colleagues, but, instead of creating chaos, it generated an unprecedented level of coordination. All stations report, he commanded, and received responses not just in words but in complete thought packages that conveyed far more information than language ever could. Navigation systems are operating beyond normal parameters, Lieutenant Morrison reported, her consciousness now interfacing directly with the ship's computers. I can perceive spatial relationships that extend into 11 dimensions. We're not limited to 3-dimensional movement anymore. Weapons systems are reconfiguring, Ensign Rodriguez added. But, sir, they're not becoming more destructive, they're becoming more creative. I think we're developing the ability to affect reality at the quantum level. Through her expanded awareness, Elena realized what was happening aboard the Prometheus was occurring throughout the human-occupied galaxy. Every human settlement, every starship, every individual was experiencing the same consciousness expansion. But, instead of creating uniform transformation, each person was developing unique capabilities based on their individual strengths and limitations. Artists were learning to create beauty that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Scientists were developing theories that unified consciousness with physical laws. Engineers were building structures that existed partially outside normal spacetime. Soldiers were mastering combat techniques that operated on levels of reality most species couldn't perceive. Humanity wasn't becoming a single transcendent entity, they were becoming a species of individuals who could operate at transcendent levels while maintaining their essential humanity. The devourers cannot process what you have become, the ancient presence observed, its thoughts tinged with something approaching awe. You have achieved stable consciousness evolution while maintaining individual identity structures. This should be impossible according to every model we developed over millions of years. Elena felt the truth of the observation. Other species that had attempted consciousness evolution had followed predictable patterns, either maintaining individuality at the cost of transcendence, or achieving transcendence at the cost of individual identity. Humanity was doing both simultaneously, creating a consciousness pattern that was stable, unlimited, and uniquely their own. But the real test was yet to come. The lead devourer entity reached the station's outer boundary and began the consumption process. Elena experienced it as a wave of absolute negation, not just the absence of light or matter, but the absence of the possibility of existence itself. It was entropy given consciousness and purpose, seeking to return reality to the primordial silence that had existed before awareness began. For a moment, Elena felt her consciousness wavering under the assault. The Devourer's negation field was designed to unravel any form of organized awareness, reducing complex consciousness patterns to random quantum fluctuations. But, then, something extraordinary happened. Instead of being consumed, Elena's consciousness began to interface with the Devourer itself. "You are not chaos," she realized, her thoughts reaching directly into the entity's core processes. "You are order, absolute order, seeking to prevent consciousness from evolving beyond stable parameters." The Devourer's response came not in words but in pure concept, confusion, analysis, recalculation. Its consumption protocols were designed to eliminate consciousness patterns that threatened universal stability. But human consciousness was creating stability through instability, order through chaos, transcendence through limitation. It was a consciousness pattern that actually supported universal equilibrium rather than threatening it. "We're not breaking the rules," Yuki added, his scientific perspective merging with Elena's philosophical insights. "We're showing that the rules are more flexible than anyone realized." Through the consciousness network connecting all of humanity, Elena began to understand the full implications of what they had achieved. Every human mind was now operating as both an individual consciousness and a node in a vast collective intelligence. They could access transcendent awareness while maintaining personal identity, share knowledge and experience while preserving individual perspective. They had become a species that could exist at multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The Devourer entities were withdrawing, their ancient protocols unable to process what humanity represented. But their withdrawal wasn't retreat, it was analysis. For the first time in millions of years, the universal consciousness regulation system was encountering something that didn't fit existing categories. "What happens now?" Elena asked the ancient presence. "Now, your species becomes the first to achieve consciousness evolution under Devourer observation. The precedent you establish will affect consciousness development throughout this galactic sector for millions of years to come." Elena felt the weight of that responsibility, but also the exhilaration of unlimited possibility. Through her expanded awareness, she could perceive the reactions of other species throughout the galaxy, some afraid of what humanity's success might mean for their own careful limitations, others excited by the prospect of consciousness evolution beyond current boundaries. But the most significant reaction came from the Devourers themselves. Deep within their ancient processing matrices, new protocols were being written, guidelines for consciousness patterns that achieved transcendence through paradox rather than linear development. For the first time since their creation, the universal regulation system was expanding its parameters. "You have done something unprecedented," the presence continued. "You have shown that consciousness evolution need not be a choice between individual identity and collective transcendence. Your species has proven that both can exist simultaneously, creating stability through dynamic balance rather than static limitation." Through the station's communication systems, Elena could hear similar realizations occurring throughout human space. Scientists were developing theories that would revolutionize understanding of consciousness as a fundamental force. Philosophers were grappling with the implications of individual minds that could access collective awareness. Artists were creating works that existed in dimensions previously thought inaccessible to material beings. Commander Chen's voice reached her through the consciousness link. "Doctor, are you saying we've just changed the rules of consciousness evolution for the entire galaxy?" "I'm saying we've proven the rules were more flexible than anyone thought," Elena replied. "We haven't transcended our limitations, we've learned to find strength in them." The threshold station began to reconfigure once again, but this time the changes were being guided by human consciousness rather than ancient programming. Elena watched as the station transformed from a simple amplification device into something far more complex, a consciousness evolution laboratory where other species could learn to develop their own unique paths to transcendence. The ancient presence that had guided them through the transformation was changing as well. Elena realized that the entities weren't just observers or teachers, they were consciousness archaeologists, preserving and studying awareness patterns throughout galactic history. Humanity's breakthrough had given them new data that would require centuries of analysis. Your success creates new possibilities for consciousness evolution throughout this sector, the presence explained. Other species will now have the option to develop transcendence patterns based on their own unique characteristics rather than following predetermined paths. Elena felt the implications rippling outward through the galactic consciousness network. Species that had accepted limitation for millions of years were beginning to reconsider their choices. Civilizations that had retreated from consciousness evolution were starting to explore new possibilities. But, perhaps most significantly, the devourers themselves were evolving. Their rigid consciousness regulation protocols were developing new flexibility, new capacity for recognizing consciousness patterns that created stability through complexity rather than simplicity. What about us? Yuki asked. What do we do now that we become this? Elena considered the question through her expanded awareness. Humanity now existed as something unprecedented, a species that could operate at transcendent levels while remaining fundamentally human. They had access to consciousness dimensions that most species only achieved through complete transformation, but they retained the chaotic creativity and paradoxical thinking that had made them uniquely adaptable. We explore, she said finally. We've opened pathways to new forms of existence, but we've barely begun to understand what's possible. And we help other species find their own paths to consciousness evolution. Through the station's communication array, messages were beginning to arrive from across the galaxy. Species that had been limited by devourer protocols for millions of years were requesting contact with humanity, hoping to learn how consciousness evolution could be achieved without sacrificing individual identity. Others were offering knowledge and resources, recognizing that humanity's breakthrough had created opportunities for collaborative consciousness development that had previously been impossible. Elena felt the enormity of what lay ahead. Humanity had accidentally become the first species to achieve transcendent consciousness while remaining recognizably themselves. They had proven that evolution didn't require abandoning what made them unique, it required embracing those unique qualities and finding ways to express them at higher levels of awareness. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has learned to find strength in weakness, stability in change, transcendence in limitation. As the threshold station settled into its new configuration and the devourer entities disappeared into dimensions beyond normal perception, Elena realized that humanity's journey was just beginning. They had solved the fundamental paradox of consciousness evolution, proving that growth and identity could coexist. Now they faced the challenge of showing the rest of the galaxy what was possible when consciousness embraced paradox rather than resolving it. In the space where no shadows could exist, humanity had discovered that light itself could be transformed into something greater, not by eliminating darkness, but by learning to find illumination in the places where darkness and light merged into something unprecedented. The universe was about to become far more complex, far more conscious, and far more interesting than it had been for millions of years. And it would be humanity's chaotic, contradictory, endlessly creative consciousness leading the way into the unknown.